Baseball is the most popular sport to simulate in the whole world.
Down the pipe, takes it for strike three call.
Now, it's easy to simulate because of the turn-based nature of the sport, even though sometimes bizarre things can happen. And the long and well-known history of the sport makes it a fun tool to relive the past. And so it should be obvious why people like playing baseball simulators. But the simulators that you and I play with and know and love, those are all a little bit odd. Have you noticed? Just about all of these games have a very specific screen setup. Here, I'll show you. Most games have some combination of a picture of a field, text, and basic stats. Replay has more or less the same setup, for example, even though the game cards are a lot different. Action PC Baseball also uses a similar setup with some animation if you want to turn that on. And Diamond Mine Baseball is exactly the same thing, play-by-play text with a simple display and a bunch of stats. Now the reason why I bring this up is because it wasn't always this way. In fact, if you go way back in time, I'm talking over 40 years ago, and look at some of the earliest PC baseball sims, you will notice that there was a totally different approach to how the results of each play were displayed. Now I know that some of you guys know about this game already, some of you have been bugging me to play it, though those of you who are a little bit younger probably don't recognize it. This is MicroLeague Baseball, copyright 1984. Now the team selection is limited and the screen resolution is messed up for some reason, but what you'll notice about this game right away is that it actually shows you what's going on. This display actually makes it really exciting when you get a result like a runner thrown out at the plate. And MicroLeague Baseball was actually a very popular game back in its day. A little bit of a secret tidbit about that game is that the creator actually was a big fan of APBA Baseball and wanted to make something similar. Anyway, MicroLeague did not last for long. Now, do you know why? Well, this is because one of the giants of baseball board games decided to enter the computer market the very next year. APBA Major League Players Baseball for DOS came out in 1985 and really revolutionized the market. Now this screen setup should look familiar to you since it's the same basic setup that most baseball sims use today. APBA was all about using your imagination instead of showing you the play result. And it was that DOS game that eventually gave us APBA Baseball for Windows, one of the most influential computer baseball sims of all time. The ease and simplicity of this game made it a hit, and it really stands out to this day. But before we can dig into why APBA's computer game was designed this way, and before we can look at how Baseball from Windows eventually fell from grace, we really need to take a step back. You see, the root of APBA's problems in the 1990s and in the 2000s actually started way back in the 1930s. And this is the history of the APBA company that you will not find on its website. Okay, there's an American tradition of dice baseball games that goes back to the mid-1880s. You would take 2 or 3 dice and roll them for imaginary players, consulting a chart that would tell you the result. Anyway, back in the mid-1920s, a man named Clifford Van Beek submitted a patent application for a game that combined those charts with individual cards for individual players. The result was a game called National Pastime, a 1930 game that was arguably the first tabletop sim. National Pastime was an utter commercial failure. It was such a spectacular failure that the company went bankrupt before a year and a half was over. But have you ever heard of those obscure rock bands that are historically important because somebody listened to them once or twice and decided to start a better band? That's exactly what happened here. A kid in Pennsylvania saw this advertisement and asked his parents for a copy of the game. This kid, J. Richard Seitz, spent years playing National Pastime and tinkering with it. Seitz called his game APBA after the name of the league that he and his friends started in the 1930s, and it grew quickly into a huge company worth millions of dollars. APBA was a very popular board game because it was easy and fast to play. Now sometimes it might not have been as realistic as some of the hardcore baseball fans wanted it to be, but the fact that you could easily play a game in 20 minutes or less more than made up for its flaws. And of course, if you can play a game in 20 minutes, it's not out of the question to play 1,000 or more and to come up with a full season replay. APBA had a number of competitors back in those days, but the most notable was Strat-O-Matic. Strat-O-Matic featured a somewhat more complex dice rolling system that allowed about half the results to come from the offense and about half from the defense. Strat was also a fast game, though there were a few quirks here and there. Now, in the early 1970s, Strat-O-Matic came out with what it called the advanced game, which included a number of improvements that went far above and beyond anything that APBA could do. And the original Strat-O-Matic advanced game was designed so that it would still play quickly. Now, those of you who are Strat fans might be familiar with just how complex the modern super advanced Strat-O-Matic game can get, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of the more arcane parts of the rulebook. The original Strat-O-Matic advanced game, however, was simpler, and it was a huge challenge to APBA's dominance. Strat-O-Matic Advanced featured righty and lefty splits for every single player out of the box, and the system was really easy to understand. The righty-lefty splits were something that APBA couldn't handle, and this posed a big problem for sides. APBA's biggest problem, of course, is that Strat made a big deal out of the new system to new players, which meant that APBA's growth was negatively impacted. Now, at first, APBA tried to push back on the cry for platooning features, claiming that such an idea would be totally unrealistic. In fact, as late as 1975, Seitz himself hinted that there was going to be no complex version of the APBA game, alluding to the fact that APBA was marketable precisely because it was so simple. But there was a lot of pressure from APBA's fan base. I mean, there was tons of it. Fans wrote letters to the APBA Journal throughout the early 1970s asking for this feature. And so Seitz cobbled something together, something that we know of today as the APBA Baseball Master Game. The APBA Master Game is big. I mean, it really is big. The game uses these huge boards, so big that I can barely fit them on my playing table. There were numerous boards devoted to things like rare plays. And you had huge boards with special instructions on how to advance on various kinds of outfielder throws and airs and all sorts of stuff. The game itself is a mess. It was a mess back then, and frankly, it's a mess now. There are numerous features in this game that simply don't work. There are things that the game tries to measure about certain players that you really can't measure. You see, the thing is that the advanced Strat-O-Matic game kept a lot of the simplicity of the original intact. APBA's response, for some strange reason, was to make the most complex game that the company could possibly make. And the truth is that while a bunch of people bought it, not a whole bunch of people played it. Of course, the fan publication The APBA Journal made a huge deal of the Master Game when it was first released in December 1975. The publication was filled with praise early on. However, if you spend time reading through the old issues of the APBA Journal, you will notice that most of the replays were completed with the basic game, not the Master Game. And in the rare event you did see a Master Game replay, it was almost always done with modified rules. In particular, replayers would modify the pitching grades APBA released in hopes of getting hits and runs per game down to realistic levels. And even with those careful controls, replayers reported results that seemed to deviate significantly from real life. But that didn't matter too much, right? I mean, all replays deviate from real life to one extent or another. And it's possible that people weren't playing with the Master Game because of its complexity and not because it was somehow less accurate. Anyway, that is the thinking that went into the creation of APBA's original computer baseball game. This was based on the Master Game. The first hint of a computer game was published in the APBA Journal in December 1984. Now, the APBA Journal article stated that there was some sort of fan survey mentioning a computer product in early 1984, though unfortunately I haven't seen it. Anyway, it was this man here, Kenneth Miller, along with his brother Roswell, who developed the game. The story is that the Miller brothers developed the game on their own based on the Master Baseball game and basically pitched it to Seitz after it was playable. J. Richard Seitz agreed to allow them to use the Master Game boards. And the game really is an almost 100% translation of the old version of the Master Game. There's really only one exception. So the Miller brothers did not translate the really complex steal allowance chart. This is this chart that would not let certain players steal unless the score was like within 2 runs and it was like the 7th inning or later or something stupid like that. In the computer game, you can steal with any player anytime that you want, including guys who maybe only had 1 steal in real life. You can still steal with them. Now, Seitz overall was pretty skeptical of the computer game, which is why he didn't sell it as his own product. Instead, he let the Miller brothers sell it through Random House, which helped market the game as well as sell it, and he received a cut of the money as some sort of licensing fee. And that's the part behind all of this that's a little bit strange. A lot of people have criticized sites over the years for not recognizing the potential the computer game could have. And that makes sense until you realize that we're talking 1983 and 1984. Newspapers all over the United States were still reporting on the great Atari crash, where a video game giant turned into a practically worthless company seemingly overnight. In the wake of the collapse of Atari and of the video game market, there's no wonder that sites thought that personal computers would likely also be a passing fad. Anyway, I know that I'm putting a lot of emphasis on this part of the story, and the thing is, I'm doing this for a reason. So in hindsight, sites made a major mistake by not getting control of the computer game right off the bat. And as we will soon see, this led in the end to the almost complete collapse of the APBA game company. Now, the original APBA Baseball computer game for DOS is fun, even if it is a little bit quirky. Sure, the game can give you a play-by-play account of a game and will do all the complex master game stuff for you. However, it cannot save its own statistics out of the box. That means that you'll have to do a lot of the legwork yourself. As late as December 1986, the APBA Journal was lamenting the fact that there was no computerized stat compiler for the computer game. Actually, it wasn't until October 1987 that the famous StatMaster program was finally released. StatMaster was absolutely revolutionary to anybody who wanted to play a replay by themselves without doing all the stats by hand. But the thing about StatMaster is that it seems to have been written in a completely different programming language from, the game itself. And this is where we get to look into the technical world of APBA's computer baseball games. The thing is that there were a ton of different components for the old DOS game that were kind of like pieced together. Each of them came with its own price tag, some of them came from different companies, and of course each one of them had its own compatibility headaches. In short, it's almost like nobody planned any of this. So it seems to me that the game itself was chiefly written in Pascal, Turbo Pascal to be exact. While Turbo Pascal is not that hard to understand, like this quadratic equation code, it's also not exactly a commonly used programming language, especially these days. Now, I suspect that Pascal might have something to do with why there's no animation in this game, though I'm not entirely sure. The thing is, though, that MicroLeague was an older game, and so it's kind of odd that it had animation while APBA didn't. Actually, I wonder if the fact that two brothers kind of slapped this together also has something to do with it. The thing is that Turbo Pascal is not exactly a complex language, and it definitely was not at the time. This was taught in schools, and it was considered to be somewhat basic. Now, I'm just guessing, I'm not a computer programmer, but maybe there were no graphics in this game because the Miller brothers didn't know how to make them. Anyway, the added presence of StatMaster and other add-ons meant that things were becoming pretty complicated pretty quickly. The instructions for something as simple as how to print out your stats required a complex chart like this one. This is from the November 1987 issue of the APBA Journal. But the game was popular and it was growing, and then there were two additional innovations that changed the baseball replay hobby for good. The first and more obvious innovation was a computer manager for the DOS game, though this thing didn't come out until fall 1991, believe it or not. MicroManager cost as much as the game itself when it was first released, but it was a very specific and finely tuned program that created a believable and realistic opponent that could manage the team you were playing against. And the name of one of the first two managers, Blaise Pascal, gives a hint of the programming backbone behind APBA's computer game. MicroManager made the computer game a lot more fun, and it also paved the way for fully automatic season replays, which became one of the hallmarks of baseball for Windows. Now, this is around the time that things were really changing in the APBA computer scene. So the Miller brothers had formed a company called Miller Associates, obviously, and they were coming up with programs and add-ons that were clearly independent of the APBA game company. That leads us directly to the most controversial and infamous of all of them. As I mentioned before, APBA players complained pretty frequently about the Master Game, and in particular the pitching ratings of the Master Game. It got to the point where an APBA league in Massachusetts created what became known as the CMBA pitching system, which was a full replacement for the Master Game's pitching grades. The CMBA system was first popularized in summer 1984 and was both complex and precise, and is still used by many APBA players to this day. And the CMBA pitching system is not the only system that's out there either. Anyway, there was some demand among APBA fans to be able to modify the pitching ratings of the players on the data discs. And the APBA Journal was actually somewhat instrumental in fanning the flames of that demand. In summer 1987, the APBA Journal printed a blurb about something called APBA, a program that would allow you to edit data disks to your heart's content. In December 1987, the program was finally announced, and it was called the Innovator. Now, the Innovator could only change things on existing disks. You couldn't use it to create your own data disks, but it was still really powerful. And the APBA Journal frequently printed content from people who went through APBA's picture grading procedures with a fine-tooth comb, recommending changes here and there. In the end, the conventional wisdom was that APBA's card-making process was flawed and that you really needed the Innovator to fix things and to make it right. Now, if you've never heard of the Innovator, even though you've played APBA Baseball on the computer for years, you are not alone. A year and a half after the Innovator was released, Miller Associates announced that a new program was going to come out. This is a program that they called the Wizard. The official story behind this was that another well-known APBA player, Ron Murrah, helped the Miller brothers develop a program that could create APBA cards based on raw statistics. This was advertised as a program that would allow you to create players that APBA didn't officially create, so you could finally do a proper season replay with all the players. And then there was this somewhat sly and backhanded comment about how the program was very similar to the APBA formula, but it wasn't exactly the APBA formula. Now there's a lot of wink wink nudge nudge that's going on here that you probably wouldn't notice if you were just reading through this for the first time today. You'd have to know about this in context. Now the APBA Journal was not overtly critical of the card making abilities of the APBA Game Company. However, by June 1989, which is when this was printed, there had been quite a few years of suggestions on how people could change things like picture grades and cards around to get more realistic replay results. And this had been going on for years, by the way. So I think I might know the reason why Miller Associates was upset enough with APBA to come out with a program like this. So case in point, earlier in 1989, there were articles about how the 1988 season disc was later than ever, presumably because the computer game people didn't have their copies of the ratings in time. There was also a theory that this might have been because of errors in the original 1988 season cards that needed to be corrected. Back in those years, there was an Apple II version of APBA's computer baseball game, and they wound up receiving an infamous letter from Sites. Sites threw the blame at Random House and, in turn, at the Miller brothers. And I'm sure that it's just a coincidence that the Miller brothers came out with a program to let people make their own APBA discs from scratch a couple of months later, right? Anyway, Wizard is the program that really changed things in the APBA world. The reason? Because with Wizard, you no longer needed to buy the discs from APBA. Wizard was APBA's biggest nightmare, though I don't think APBA realized this at first. Wizard let you do two different things. You could create your own discs and you could read data from other discs. You could use it to simply input existing APBA cards that you happen to have, or you could put in the stats and let the program make the discs for you automatically. It might seem simple, but the program was actually extremely powerful. The thing about Wizard is that it took away this mystique that had been made around the APBA card creating process with the formula and all of this stuff. J. Richard Sites had worked really hard on building up this mystique over decades, and it was all dead almost right away. Plus, the other thing is that Wizard came out not long before the mess of APBA DOS games and utilities all wound up being put together in a very nice and relatively easy to use package. The world of computers took a big step forward when Windows 3.1 was released in the spring of 1992. Now, Windows 3.1 ran as a shell on top of MS-DOS, which means that DOS was still your operating system. However, Windows could do a lot in terms of customization, but the thing is, in the early days, there were not a ton of programs that were created specifically for Windows. So my family got our first computer around that time. It was December 1992, actually. I was 8 years old. I remember it really well. Now, Windows 3.1 was cool, but there was not a whole ton you could actually do with it other than play around with something like Microsoft Paint and some of the other early accessories. Now, Windows had a lot of capabilities, it had a lot of potential, but it still needed the software, and back then most of the software was still in DOS. Anyway, Miller Associates decided that this would be the perfect time to upgrade the APBA computer game to the world of Windows. Now, if you look at the makeup of APBA Baseball for Windows, you will notice that it's split up into different programs, which is a holdover from the old DOS days. Advanced Draft, for example, was an upgraded version of the old Draft program that would allow you to redraft players into your own custom teams. You could make trades, do stuff like that. League Manager allowed you to create schedules and play around with a fatigue and injury management system called AIM, Advanced Injury Management. There was also a new version of Statmaster, which was easier to use and more friendly than ever. And then you had this thing called the Bill James Encyclopedia. We'll get back to that in a second. But the most impressive part about Baseball for Windows was the program itself. Yeah, it was the DOS game. It's still the same game, but this was an amazingly updated version of the DOS game. The game featured full-color stadiums, expanded play-by-play, a fully integrated computer manager, and a whole lot more. Later versions, like the one I'm playing here, also had all sorts of additional color commentary. And the commentary was improved to the point where you felt like you were really reading a radio broadcast. And some of you guys know already where I'm going with this one. So the vast majority of you who remember playing APBA Baseball for Windows are probably wondering when I'm finally going to get to this part. You see, Miller Associates decided to make a contract with Ernie Harwell, the longtime radio broadcaster of the Detroit Tigers. This was a big, big deal. The APBA Journal had a front page notice in March 1995 announcing that the new version of the Windows game would require a CD-ROM since Harwell's voice required a whopping 5 megabytes of disk space. I mean, the presentation here is nothing short of amazing.
Now the delivery. Cooper lofts an air job to left. O'Neill and Jones range over. O'Neill says he'll take it. And just barely does. A little snow cone in his glove. One down.
It's so good that you could sit down and just listen to a game without reading the play-by-play text yourself.
Hahn races over it, but he won't get it. S is going for 2, and there will be a play at second. The tag, safe on a very close play. Double for S.
In fact, you can actually turn the scrolling play-by-play text off if you want.
His squad this way. Donahue at first base. Isbell at second. Davis, the shortstop.
Now, the thing that makes Baseball for Windows work so well is Harwell's cadence as a broadcaster. The thing is that the program had a few natural pauses in it because it had to read like the correct section of the CD. Harwell's slower style and natural cadence were perfect fits for this game. Now, here I'll show you. So this is from the 1982 ALCS, the CBS radio broadcast.
Thank you, Denny Matthews, and hi again, everybody. It is a beautiful day, and incidentally, the left field area here at County Stadium is the sun field, very much like it is in the Yankee Stadium. Normally, right field, as you know, is the sun field, but it might be very treacherous out in left and left center with the sun shining in the outfielder's eyes in that direction. Hardly any clouds up there to use as a background for any kind of a fly ball.
So do you see what I mean? Harwell had the sort of voice that fit in perfectly with what Miller Associates needed. The vast majority of people who have played this game remember it as being the Ernie Harwell game, not just the old APBA game that happened to be ported over to Windows. Anyway, this game was big. I mean, really, really big. It was a lot more popular than you would expect, and it received quite a bit of mainstream media coverage. The original DOS game did get some newspaper attention, such as this article in Newsday in July 1985. There were also newspaper articles like this, and yes, this is back in the days when these companies would actually advertise their products. Imagine that. Meanwhile, the first Baseball for Windows game received a lot of media attention, including in this issue of Larry Flynt's Video Games magazine. Video Games was kind of impressed, despite the fact that this was a text game. Of course, the reviewer was disappointed with the lack of animation and sound, but the score for playability here is actually pretty good, and the overall score was quite good for a game like this. And there were other magazines, including ones that unfortunately I have not been able to find scans of. Baseball for Windows was considered to be the best of the baseball computer games at that time, and it got to something approaching legendary status once Ernie Harwell came along. I mean, Baseball for Windows with Ernie Harwell was a huge deal, and it got tons of attention from media outlets all over North America. Harwell's voice and sense of humor fit in perfectly with the feeling of the game, and the Miller brothers did an amazing job. It even gets to the point where Harwell will start telling you stories or reading letters from fans when the game is boring. So if you think that like 11 Labs voice AI is impressive, you really have to check out the Broadcast Blast version of Baseball for Windows. The guys at Miller Associates did a really impressive job of using Ernie Harwell's voice, and to be frank with you, there's nothing that even remotely competes with it, even in today's world of baseball sims, and I'm including OOTP with that. It's just not the same. Play both of them together, you'll see. But there was one more feature that really raised eyebrows. It's one thing to talk about Baseball for Windows being an amazing game, sure. It's another thing entirely to talk about Baseball for Windows giving you the ability to create any season in baseball history without you needing to spend a dime. You see, Miller Associates also came out with an encyclopedia that worked directly with the Wizard program to create those season discs automatically and extremely quickly. And believe it or not, this CD was rare for a long time. So Miller Associates stopped publishing this sometime in the late 1990s. Now you could still get the Wizard program for Windows directly from APBA up until the early 2000s. I know this personally. So in 2001, my dad and I took a big trip across the country. We went over to Lancaster, Pennsylvania and visited the APBA building, which is no longer the APBA building. And we bought it like in person there. So I know they were still selling it in 2001. But the thing is that back then, the Bill James Encyclopedia was really hard to find. It would routinely go for over $100 on eBay. The reason why is because that disc made all of the APBA discs completely obsolete. So the thing is that Baseball for Windows made it really easy to perform a complete season replay, again, really quickly. Now, when you've got the 1957 Ted Williams hitting .409, it's probably not awful, right? But when Stan Musial hits .412 in the same replay, that's a sign that there might be something wrong with either the game or with the cards. And, well, you could always just fix the cards. You see, the problem is that seasons automatically generated by the Encyclopedia and Wizard tended to be more accurate in Baseball for Windows than the seasons that you would buy directly from APBA. This was a massive hit to the mystique behind the APBA game company. As you likely already know, APBA's reputation for accuracy was hurt as early as the mid-1970s when it came out with the 1949 season. The cards look fine, sure, but they don't play accurately at all. So back in 1974 and 75, a guy named Conrad Horn famously played a complete 1949 replay in which offense was way too high. This is because there were too many walks. Conrad Horn had gone as far as complaining directly to the APBA game company, and the company replied that there was nothing wrong with the cards and implied that he was doing something wrong. So it took about 20 years, but Baseball for Windows essentially proved that the APBA game company had a really hard time making accurate cards for its own game. See, Seitz had this awful habit of kind of like guessing and fudging things so that they felt right to him, and in the long run, this really hurt his company. You see, the thing is that companies like APBA make their money off of the discs, not necessarily off the game itself. The company would make a bit of money selling the game itself, sure. But in the long term, the real money was always in selling the disc that you would need to buy if you wanted to play with a particular season. Games like Diamond Mine Baseball operate on the exact same logic to this day. The company makes most of its money selling you season discs. In contrast, Out of the Park Baseball makes its money by selling you the complete game every year, giving you every single season entirely free. But so like for OOTP, the transaction database is really bad and you can't change the underlying database without having to get in and having to change a whole bunch of different fields and hope that you get it right. That's the thing. Every one of these games has its own positive and negative elements. Anyway, because of the business model that APBA had used for decades, that combination of the Encyclopedia and Wizard did an immense amount of damage to the company's bottom line. With the ability to create seasons on the fly that were more accurate than APBA, all of the mystique that Seitz had created over the years wound up disappearing. There were freeware utilities out there that could work with automatically generated discs to make the cards look a little bit more like normal APBA cards in case you wanted to print them out and play with them on a tabletop. There was also a program that allowed you to normalize statistics from different baseball seasons to offer a more level playing field for cross-era play. So at the same time, people started to talk again about how APBA originally came from National Pastime. So the thing is that APBA itself was a derivative product. It was not just something that Seitz thought of. And so there were some enterprising card creators and editors who decided to keep working on not just the cards, but also on the boards. This is where a lot of the alternative games, alternative forms of APBA and games derived from APBA come from. For example, National Pastime Next Generation Plus is a complete reimagining of the old APBA and National Pastime concept. It's a tabletop game that can be played using Excel-based card readers, but the general ideas behind it are clearly related to the developments in the APBA community in the late 1990s. Similarly, Bill Staffa's Skeetersoft NP3 evolved out of his carefully created and modified Baseball for Windows discs. The PC version of NP3 might not have the bells and whistles of Baseball for Windows, but it's a far more statistically accurate simulation. And the community itself was being splintered. I mean, it's still splintered to this day. At the same time, there were lawsuits and threats of lawsuits from various baseball players who were trying to go after all of these major game companies. This included current players and some former players. The pressure really started to get to APBA. J. Richard Sides passed away in late September 1992, which left the APBA Game Company in kind of a lurch. By early 1995, the APBA Game Company made a somewhat odd decision to join forces with other companies, including the company that owned the rights to MicroLeague Baseball. And so if you look at some of these APBA catalogs from the mid-1990s, you will see as many MicroLeague products as APBA products. And there was a bit of an attempt to get people to come back to the board game, back to the place where they couldn't just use the computer to bypass all of APBA's products. But that was way too little, way too late. APBA's problems started to mount. And the worst part about all of this, as I said before, is that APBA did not really own APBA Baseball for Windows or even the DOS game. A lot of the problems that APBA was dealing with should have been offset by the popularity of the computer game, except that APBA did not own the computer game. This is thanks to Sites' lack of foresight. And, well, APBA went bankrupt. I mean, technically it was the company that owned APBA that went under, but it was basically the same thing. Now, the brand did survive that bankruptcy, but Baseball for Windows was in an uncertain state for years and years. It was actually this ugly period of time that convinced my dad and I to move over to Diamond Mine Baseball since, that company still supported its own product. It wasn't until 2007 that APBA finally acquired Baseball for Windows. This means that the computer game lasted almost 25 years with the APBA name without formally being an APBA product. And it still took the company years, years, to finally update the product. Remember when I told you about Turbo Pascal earlier in this video, right? The problem is that there are not a whole ton of people who are familiar with that language, which made the game difficult to update. Anyway, it has been updated and you can still buy it, though honestly it seems that the APBA Game Company is a bit reluctant to heavily support the product. Version 6.1 is the latest version of the program, and it's got the same division into 4 different programs that the very first Windows edition had. Though it's not clearly stated here, the new versions of Baseball for Windows will not read the disks that were automatically generated through Wizard and the old Encyclopedia. The product still does sell, though nowhere near as much as it once did, and honestly, this is a game that is over 40 years old at this point. So APBA is kind of in a tricky position these days. There are still leagues out there that still use Baseball for Windows and have been using it for decades. Now, the company keeps talking over and over again about how it thinks that there's some people who are pirating disks by sharing them or something like that, though there's basically no evidence of this whatsoever. I don't know, maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. Nobody's sent me any pirated anything, right? And this is the reason why I'm using this old version on a Windows XP virtual machine to show you how it worked. Now, the thing is that in reality, Baseball for Windows has had a really rocky past, and honestly, I think that it's just about time for APBA to just move on. APBA's latest computer push has been APBA Go, which is basically the APBA board game done in an online multiplayer environment. In November 2025, APBA Go decided to come out with a master game module, which is probably the first clear sign that the company is moving in a different direction than the old Baseball for Windows program. Now, if you read through these forum messages, you'll notice that the old veteran APBA players remember a lot about the problems with the old master game. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. Personally, as much as I hate the online-only games, I do think that APBA should move towards Go. The reason why is because it's cross-platform, it's a lot more mobile-friendly than the older software solutions. But you do still have quite a few APBA fans out there with huge collections of Baseball for Windows software, not to mention all the specially made season discs that did not come from APBA, all the micromanagers, all the stadium pictures, and all of these old utilities that are still passed around. So the thing is, in the end, your company will not be successful if it is competing with itself. As sad as this sounds, in the end, the APBA Baseball Master Game is also just not a great product. The Ernie Harwell elements are great, and I'm still puzzled as to why no other game does anything even remotely like this.
Kicks and deals. Howard into left field. O'Neill is right there and pulls it down. That's 3 away.
So for example, OOTP has some animation, sure, but it's just not the same without the voice of a famous announcer. And honestly, I'm having a hard time seeing how OOTP's animations are really that much better than a simple game like Best Play Pro Yaku on the Famicom. Of course, APBA's other problem is that it has no pitch-by-pitch mode, which is the industry standard among modern baseball sims. With no pitch-by-pitch mode, APBA simply cannot compete with the games that are on the market today. It's just too antiquated. Anyway, this is a much bigger problem than APBA Go is going to solve. Not only do you have to convince kids to play a board game that dates back to 1950, but you've also got to convince them that this game is better than all of the other games that are out there that offer so much more for less money. Anyway, good luck to those who are running APBA these days. And as for Baseball for Windows, I mean, it's a timeless classic, especially with Ernie Harwell's voice. It's awesome. But the way that things went down in the 1990s really left a sour taste in the mouths of a lot of us who were big fans and for a long time big defenders of this product. And honestly, I really think it's time for all of us to just move on.